I regularly get asked to share how it is that we innovate. As with any team that has had some innovation success, we are proud of our approach. However, I caught myself the other day realizing that we have become over-enamored with our innovation methodology. The result being is that we've stagnated on improving it. When was the last time you looked at your innovation approach and innovated it? I'll be right back.
This is the Killer Innovations Podcast with Phil McKinney. Keep in mind that the information and opinions expressed in this podcast are Phil's, and Phil's alone, and they don't necessarily reflect those of his past, current, or future employers. Now, here's Phil McKinney.
Whenever we talk about innovation, we tend to focus on the process of coming up with an idea and then translating it into something like new products, new services, new processes. To ensure we get good at coming up with new products or services, we put processes and methodologies in place. I don't know what this is, but maybe it tends to be the engineering focus of innovation, but we tend to get so process-oriented. Why? Because we want to improve the quality of the ideas. We want to better manage the selection of the ideas, and then we want to monitor that execution because we want to ensure success at the other end. And once we have an innovation methodology in place that works, we hunker down and we focus on cranking out ideas. We finally got a process that works. It works in the organization. And what do? We focus on filling up that idea pipeline, crank out more ideas, do a better job of selecting, execute those projects on the other end. Now, this is not always a bad thing. I mean, we do need processes. We do need to figure out ways and document ways that work within any given organization. It's one of the reasons why I advise people that says don't try to take somebody else's innovation methodology and apply it to your organization. Each and every organization is different. You're unique. So once you've modified that methodology and once you have that process down, we're anxious to lock it down and then just execute like crazy. Now, the problem is the process and methodologies we use to improve our innovation quickly become the norm. They become the rule. They become the assumption. And whenever those happen, that's a bad thing in my mind, right? Because we tend to get locked in. We always innovate this way. Well, haven't we always talked in previous podcasts about avoiding kind of those mental traps, right? So whether any methodology any of us deploy, we've built in some biases, and these are the things we got to be careful of, these rules or these assumptions, right? So what are some examples of these kind of written or unwritten biases that effectively get built into our methodologies? One is the selection criteria used to identify the best ideas. For example, I've seen companies that say, in order for an idea to be selected, it has to meet a specific gross margin target. If you can't get above a certain gross margin target, we're not interested. Or it must be able to generate, a minimum amount of revenue in X years. That's a bias, particularly if you work in a very, very large organization, right? Because many ideas, the revenue number just tends to be way too small to have any kind of a significant impact. It's a bias, and a bias you need to be aware of. Another bias could be organizational constraints. For instance, we only want to look at ideas that leverage the R&D pipeline that we already have in an area of expertise we already have. Or it has to utilize our distribution network or our retail channel or our sales force or, our partner organizations. Or you could also have a cultural bias. Only ideas that get the support from certain managers survive. That's kind of an unwritten bias, right? We tend to understand that in order for the ideas to be successful, history has shown that an idea has to be approved by a certain person, and maybe it's not even a senior executive, but you quickly learn the key people that you have to get an idea passed in order for it to be successful. That's an unwritten bias that we naturally build in to our innovation methodologies. These biases sneak in and then they start to restrict and eventually kill the innovation process. What you cannot afford to do is to stop innovating the way you innovate. It's not about just doing innovation, but really innovating the way you innovate. It's about improving the process of innovation, and it's about identifying these assumptions under which you innovate and then challenging those assumptions. What are the biases? So if you really do have these biases, such as it's got to be a certain gross margin or it's got to be a certain revenue, ask yourself why. Constantly question why those biases. What are those assumptions that you've built into your innovation methodology, into the idea selection, into the organizational constraints, into we always have to follow these gates to approve the funding model for a given idea. Challenge your assumptions and then be willing to blow it up, to literally go in, kill the current innovation methodology you have, and start from scratch. Challenge the organization. My general rule of thumb is that when things are going smooth, I get nervous. Because as soon as it smooths out, if there isn't angst in the organization, if there isn't stress on the team, if there isn't some negative pushback coming from different parts of the organization, then that tells me that we've locked into a process, we've locked into a methodology that eventually will lead to a lack of innovation, even if it is the innovation process. We tend to want to think that once I've got an innovation methodology in place, that I can just crank it out and I'll just keep this pipeline of great ideas coming. That is wrong. The key is innovation comes from change. Innovation comes from challenge. Innovation comes from angst in the organization. If you look back to some of the best ideas and the best innovations that have ever come out in the marketplace, when did they come about? They came about when organizations were under stress, and whether that be economic downturns or severe competitors coming into the marketplace, change in management, whatever it is, stress in the organization where, oh my gosh, we need to come up with great ideas, we need to come up with innovations because we need this to survive. Stress in the organization is where ideas come from. Now, what I'm not saying is go inject those kinds of stresses, but when everything is going smooth, there's less feeling of need to make change. And that is the exact moment when you need to make change happen. So again, you need to be willing to continue to innovate the way you innovate. Now, here's the question. Have you ever turned the process that you actually have, assuming that you have an innovation methodology and an innovation process in place, have you ever taken that process and used it against the actual approach of innovation? So use your innovation approach or innovation methodology to innovate how you innovate. Now, I know this sounds crazy, and there's a paradox in here somewhere, right? So you're using the innovation process to look at innovating the innovation process. It kind of makes my head hurt even thinking about it, but it's critical for innovation to survive inside the organizations. Now, companies that are continuously looking at innovating how they innovate are rare. They are very rare. They are the ones that seem to be able to survive the transitions that companies go through. For example, if you're looking at changing of industries, right? Think about Netflix as it is today. Netflix started off with mailing the DVD discs to its customers, right? You could have so many discs and it would automatically mail them to you. And now Netflix has completely switched over, not completely, but has switched over to now streaming the videos. Very few companies can go through that kind of fundamental transition where they start off with one entire business model and shift to an exact different kind of a business model. In fact, you can think of a lot of other competitors in the movie rental space that tried that in the past and were not able to bridge over from one area to another area. Foreign competition's another example, right? Look at what happens to the auto industry. Foreign competition comes in and they totally change and decimate an existing industry. And in fact, it took a financial crisis to fundamentally change the U.S. auto industry. Up until that time, the U.S. auto industry couldn't make the change. They couldn't make the transition. What forced the auto industry to make the fundamental change? It became the issues of the financial crises. They had no choice. They had to change or they would not survive. Mergers and acquisitions. Look at all the banks that have been merged up as a result of the financial crises that we've gone through. Here's another example was you need to be able to use those opportunities. In this case, mergers and acquisitions and the surviving banks, the banks that actually did the acquiring. If you look under the hood, those are the organizations that constantly are challenging themselves to look at their business different, their market different, and innovating the way they innovate. Another great example is a sudden shock to an industry. Look at what happened in the 70s in the oil embargo with Royal Dutch Shell. Why is it that Royal Dutch Shell survived the oil embargo so well relative to all of the other oil producers during the 70s? It was because they constantly looked at the way they innovated. In fact, one of the ways that they innovated the way they innovated is they invented the whole concept of scenario planning as part of a fundamental business strategy activity. And they brought in that scenario planning activity, and they actually created a scenario far before the oil embargo that said, what happened if there was a disruption to oil supply? What would that do? And they worked out all of the actions that they would take. And then guess what? When the oil embargo happened, Royal Dutch Shell was right there with the right time, with the right knowledge. They had already innovated the ideas ahead of time, and they could then just drive in and execute accordingly. And as a result, they came out a much stronger company to become a leader in their industry because they innovated the way they innovated. Now, there's lots of ways or lots of activities that drive these kinds of stresses into the organizations. The key here is not to wait for those stresses to occur. Use the model of Royal Dutch Shell and think about, how is it that I can innovate the way I innovate before I need to innovate? So don't wait for the financial crises. Don't wait for the oil embargo to happen. But how do you innovate the way you innovate before you need to innovate? Now, here's the hard part. We all need to take those times to step back and be honest with ourselves. And you need to take the emotion out of your innovation methodology, right? So in my case, I have a personal attachment to the processes and the milestone gates and everything the way we do our innovation. But I need to be willing myself to take a step back and really take a look at it. Disconnect my emotional attachment to what's best for the organization. And we need to challenge each other to blow up the process and create one that's even better than the one we have today. That's right. Just because you think you've got a great innovation approach doesn't mean you're done. There's always opportunity to innovate. There's always ways to innovate in products and services. And likewise, there's always ways to innovate the way you innovate. Otherwise, we risk becoming a footnote in the history books. Thank you for listening to the Killer Innovations Podcast. If you have feedback on this podcast or suggestions for future shows, please email them to feedback@philmckinney.com. The full archive of the show, now numbering more than 120, is available at the Apple iTunes Store, the Zune Marketplace, and at philmckinney.com. To help you share the podcast with others, we've collected the most popular shows onto a 2-disc CD set titled Creating Killer Innovations. You can find the CD over at Amazon, or you can order it directly by visiting philmckinney.com. Don't miss out on the opportunity to connect with others interested in innovation and creativity. Participate by commenting on the show notes. There's also Killer Innovations groups on LinkedIn and Facebook. So join in and connect. Links are over at the main page on the site. So why do I spend the time and money to produce the podcast? I was the beneficiary of the time and energy from a mentor early in my career. When I asked how I could pay it back, he told me to pay it forward. This podcast is my way of paying it forward. All I ask of you is to pay it forward by telling others about the podcast on Twitter, Facebook, or whatever your choice of social communication is. The content of this podcast is made available under Creative Commons license, non-commercial, non-derivative, with attribution.